Hi, I never thought I'd be writing something like this, about my wife's betrayal with someone close to me, particularly a family. About the secrets I uncovered, the rage that consumed me, and the choices I made that would change all our lives forever. Because here's the thing, I didn't just confront her. I didn't just leave her. I sold her. Yes, you heard that right. I handed her over to strangers in a foreign land, thinking that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. She came back, and what she did next left me utterly speechless. Let's start from the beginning. I often thought of our house as a monument to everything I'd built. A sanctuary, a fortress. It stood tall on the hillside, its modern lines cutting against the landscape, a physical manifestation of my discipline, my control. Inside, the air was always warm, filled with the small comforts Mira curated so expertly. The smell of fresh bread, the subtle hum of soft music, the meticulous arrangement of furniture that suggested effortlessness. Mira had a way of making even the grandest space feel inviting. She moved through the house with purpose, her presence always calming. She was the kind of woman who made you believe in perfection. For years I had believed it too. When Ethan pulled into the driveway that evening, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. He climbed out of his car, a beaten-down thing that seemed to mirror his own state. Unkempt, exhausted, carrying the weight of his failures like a second skin. My brother was a living contradiction. Charming enough to make people believe in him, but reckless enough to squander every opportunity. Mira appeared beside me at the window. She always did that. Seemed to sense when I needed her before I even realized it myself. Her hand rested on my arm as we watched Ethan hesitate outside the car. "Don't be too hard on him," she murmured. Her words were a balm to my growing irritation. Of course, I wouldn't be hard on him. I never had been, and that was part of the problem. Ethan had always relied on my forgiveness, my ability to fix the messes he made. When I greeted him at the door, he had the same sheepish grin I'd seen countless times before. The one that apologized without really taking responsibility. Mira welcomed him warmly, her smile bright and genuine in a way that surprised me. She'd never been particularly fond of Ethan, finding his lack of ambition frustrating. But now she fussed over him, ushering him into the house like he was an old friend rather than a wayward sibling. That night at dinner I watched them both. Ethan, for all his flaws, had a knack for lightening a room. He cracked jokes about his bad luck, spinning his misfortune into a comedy routine, and Mira laughed more than I'd heard her laugh in months. It should have eased the tension in my chest, but instead, it lingered, a faint hum I couldn't shake. Later, as I stood in the living room with a glass of scotch, I found myself staring at the photograph from our wedding day. Myra's smile in that picture was one of pure joy, untainted by the disappointments that come with time. Back then, I believed I could shield her from everything. Heartache, uncertainty, the chaos of the world. But as the house settled into silence and I heard Ethan's footsteps upstairs, I realized that something had shifted. It was subtle, like the faint crack of ice before it splits wide open. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, Ethan was family. Mira was devoted. My life was steady, perfect even, wasn't it? At first, I chalked it up to Myra's natural kindness. She'd always been thoughtful, a gracious host, someone who went out of her way to make others feel comfortable. When she brought Ethan fresh towels before I even thought to ask, or set an extra plate aside for him at lunch, it didn't seem unusual. She was simply being Mira. But as the days stretched into weeks, her attentiveness toward him began to feel different. Ethan, for his part, played the role of the humbled guest well. He thanked her for every small gesture, his charm dialed up just enough to seem sincere. He worked on my nerves, but Mira seemed oblivious. She started spending more time in the guest wing, helping him settle in. I found them in the kitchen one morning, heads bent together over the coffee maker, laughing at some private joke. When I walked in, Mira straightened abruptly, brushing her hair behind her ear. Ethan didn't miss a beat, offering me a casual greeting as if nothing was out of place. Later that evening I mentioned it, tentatively at first. I didn't want to come across as accusatory, but the words sat heavy in my mouth. Myra's response was quick and dismissive, a soft laugh as she waved it off. She told me I was being silly, that Ethan needed support, not suspicion. She kissed my cheek and told me to stop overthinking. I tried to let it go, but small inconsistencies began to add up. Mira, who had always been meticulous, suddenly started misplacing her phone. I'd find it left on the kitchen counter or forgotten in the living room, always locked. Once, when she stepped away to take a call, I noticed the faintest change in her tone, a softness that wasn't meant for me. Ethan, too, began to grate on me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. His jokes, once amusing, now felt designed to undermine me. He teased Mira about her cooking, calling it a miracle she'd learned to make more than toast. She laughed, but it felt like more than just good humor. The final straw came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I'd stepped into the backyard to water the plants, only to return and find them in the living room. Mira was leaning over Ethan's shoulder as he fiddled with the settings on her tablet. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, her smile warm and easy. She looked up when she heard me and pulled away, too quickly. Ethan gave me a casual wave, unbothered, but I saw the tension flicker across Myra's face before she turned back to her tablet. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling, my mind churning. Myra's laugh echoed in my head, the sound tainted now by suspicion. Ethan had always been a charmer, and I knew better than anyone how easily he could win people over. But this was Mira, my wife. Still, the cracks in my certainty deepened. It began with her phone. Mira had always been casual about her devices, leaving them on counters or tucked in drawers, often forgetting to charge them. Now her phone was glued to her side. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd hear the faint chime of a message. She'd shift in bed, the glow of the screen illuminating her face, and I'd watch as her fingers moved quickly, replying. When I asked who it was, she smiled faintly, brushing it off as work or a late text from a friend. She'd always had a gift for making lies sound harmless. I started staying up later, pretending to read while she texted. Her responses became more measured, careful, as if she could sense my eyes on her. I began waking in the middle of the night to find her missing. I'd hear her soft voice from downstairs, the muffled rhythm of a one-sided conversation. One night, I slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway. Mira was in the living room, her back to me, the phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, and I could only catch fragments. He doesn't suspect anything. My heart thudded in my chest. I froze, straining to hear more, but she moved toward the window, lowering her voice further. After a moment, she ended the call and stood in silence, staring out at the darkened yard. When she finally came back to bed, I pretended to be asleep, my mind racing. The next morning, I made the decision. It wasn't something I did lightly. I told myself it was necessary. I purchased a discreet set of cameras and installed them when she was out. One in the living room, one in the kitchen, and another in the guest wing. I hated the violation of it, but I needed answers. For days I watched. I checked the footage late at night when I was alone, searching for proof that my gut wasn't leading me astray. At first, there was nothing, just mundane moments of Mira going about her day. Then I found it. It was a Sunday afternoon. Ethan had just come back from a run, his shirt clinging to his chest, damp with sweat. Mira met him in the kitchen, offering him a glass of water. They stood close, their conversation casual at first, then quieter. She touched his arm lightly, a gesture that lingered too long. When Ethan leaned in and kissed her, I felt the blood drain from my face. I rewound the footage, hoping I'd imagined it. But there it was, clear and undeniable. Her hands rose to his chest, and for a moment, she resisted. But then she softened, leaning into him. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. It wasn't just the kiss, it was the ease of it, the familiarity. This wasn't the first time. For hours, I sat there, numb, replaying the footage in my mind. Every laugh they'd shared, every touch I'd brushed off, now burned in my memory as evidence of their betrayal. When Mira returned that evening, she smiled at me. The same smile she'd given me for years, but now it felt like a mask. I nodded, forcing myself to respond as though nothing had changed. But everything had. The days that followed felt like a waking nightmare. Myra's presence in the house, once comforting, now suffocated me. I couldn't look at her without seeing that moment in the kitchen. The way she leaned into Ethan like he was her anchor. My trust, once unshakable, was in ruins. But it wasn't enough. Betrayal at that level doesn't come without context, without roots. I needed to know how deep this went, how far they'd fallen. Ethan, my brother, my blood. I couldn't fathom how he'd allowed himself to do this. To me, fueled by rage and the need for answers, I turned my attention to Ethan. His story of financial ruin had always been vague, the details slippery. But now, as I reflected on his evasions, it all seemed deliberate. His excuses about work, his reluctance to explain the nature of his debt, they had always been red flags. I started combing through the records of my business, a construction company I'd built from the ground up. Ethan had been helping with the accounts, or so he claimed, as part of his effort to get back on track. It didn't take long to find discrepancies. At first, they were small, an invoice here, a payment there. But the deeper I dug, the worse it got. Funds were being funneled into shell accounts, amounts rounded up or down to hide what had been siphoned off. Then I found the transfers. It was all there. Large sums of money moving from one account to another, and finally to an offshore entity tied to a known criminal syndicate. Ethan wasn't just stealing. He was laundering money. Using my company to clean up the proceeds of some other operation. I sat there in my office, my heart pounding as I stared at the evidence on the screen. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was complicity. Ethan had dragged me into something dangerous, something that could destroy everything I'd worked for. I called in a favor from an old acquaintance in finance, someone with access to deeper records. Within hours, I had confirmation. Ethan's debts were tied to gambling, but the people he owed weren't run-of-the-mill loan sharks. They were part of a sprawling criminal network, the kind that didn't forgive easily. Worse still, Mira wasn't innocent in this. My contact's report included details I hadn't expected. Messages from her to Ethan, offering support, urging him to stay strong, and promising that we'll make this right. I realized then that Mira wasn't just an unwitting accomplice. She was involved, encouraging him, aiding him. The betrayal ran so deep it felt like drowning. Ethan wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was dragging her into his chaos, and together they were threatening to unravel everything I had built. That night, as the two of them laughed in the living room over some shared joke, I stood in the shadows, watching. My rage had crystallized into something cold and sharp. They thought they were clever, but they had underestimated me. The night I confronted them, the air in the house felt charged, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. I'd spent days preparing, every piece of evidence meticulously organized in my mind. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a reckoning. Mira sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her posture relaxed. Ethan lounged in the armchair opposite her, nursing a drink he hadn't bothered to ask for. It was a picture of casual comfort, the two of them in my home, enjoying the life I had built. I stepped into the room, and the atmosphere shifted. They both glanced at me, Myra's expression softening in that practiced way she used to disarm me. Ethan, on the other hand, barely looked up, his arrogance a thorn I had grown tired of ignoring. I didn't waste time. "How long has it been going on?" I asked, my voice low but steady. Myra's brow furrowed in confusion, or at least a performance of it. "What are you talking about?" she asked, setting her phone down carefully, as if already aware of the fragility of the moment. I turned to Ethan. "You've been stealing from me," I said, my tone sharpening, "and using my business to launder your debts." That got his attention. He sat up straighter, his face a careful mask of irritation. "That's ridiculous," he said, his tone too casual to be convincing. "I don't know what you're talking about." "And you," I said, turning back to Mira, "have been helping him, supporting him while you've been screwing him behind my back." Myra's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "Alex, that's absurd," she managed finally. "I would never. How could you even think?" "I have proof," I interrupted, cutting through her denial like a blade. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a flash drive, holding it up for them to see.
Surveillance fautage.
Bank records. Messages. It's all here. The room went silent, the weight of my words settling over them like a shroud. Myra's facade cracked first. She stood, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with something that might have been regret, or maybe fear. "Alex, I can explain," she began, her voice breaking. "It's not what you think." It's exactly what I think," I said coldly. "And I don't want your excuses." Ethan, however, didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "All right, you caught us," he said, his tone laced with defiance. "But let's not act like you're some saint here. You've always had it easy, Alex. Always looking down on me, acting like you're better than me. Maybe I wanted to take a piece of what you don't appreciate." His words ignited something in me, a fury so cold it felt like ice. I stepped closer, looming over him. "You didn't just take from me," I said, my voice dangerously low. "You've ruined everything. My business, my marriage, my life. And you thought you could get away with it." Ethan shrugged, his smirk widening. "Looks like I already have." Mira turned to him, her voice rising in panic. "Ethan, stop. Don't make this worse." But it was too late. The damage was done. I stood there, watching them unravel before me, their dynamic shifting under the weight of the truth. Myra's regret was a hollow echo, too little, too late. Ethan's defiance was predictable, his arrogance blinding him to the gravity of what was coming. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was an attack, and I wasn't going to let it go unanswered. As I turned and left the room, their voices followed me. Mira pleading, Ethan taunting. But I didn't respond. My plan was already in motion, and they wouldn't see it coming. The morning after the confrontation, I made my first move. Sitting at the breakfast table, I forced a smile, the kind of strained, hollow thing Mira would interpret as exhaustion. She sipped her coffee quietly, stealing glances at me, her expression carefully composed. Ethan, predictably, avoided eye contact altogether. "I've been thinking," I began, keeping my voice measured. "We're family. We've all made mistakes. But there's no point in tearing everything apart." Myra's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief, and for a moment, Ethan froze mid-bite. I watched the tension ease from their shoulders as my words sank in. "You're saying you'll forgive us?" Myra's voice trembled slightly, hope and caution mingling in every syllable. I nodded slowly, as if the decision weighed heavily on me. "But there will be rules," I added, letting a hint of authority creep into my tone. "Ethan, no more involvement in my business. Mira, no more secrets. We move forward together or not at all." Ethan gave a sardonic shrug, muttering something about working things out like adults. Mira, on the other hand, practically sagged with relief, her voice spilling over with promises to make things right. But I wasn't done. Later that day, under the guise of clearing my head, I locked myself in my office and began to make the calls. My contacts were not the kind of people you found in a directory. Over the years, I'd cultivated relationships on the edges of legality. People who thrived in the gray spaces where power and money intersected. These were not friends, but tools, and now I would wield them. The first call went to a broker who specialized in special arrangements. I'd met him years ago during a construction deal with some shady backers, and I knew he'd have the connections I needed. "I need someone removed," I said, my tone flat. "Not permanently, but relocated." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a dry chuckle. That's a tricky request, Alex. Relocation is expensive, especially if you want it to stick. Money isn't the issue, I replied. I'll pay whatever it takes, and I have a specific destination in mind. The broker didn't ask questions. He never did. Within the hour, he sent me the name of a Turkish contact who specialized in human transactions. It was ugly work, but so was betrayal. Meanwhile, I began planting seeds to dismantle Ethan's world. I pulled up the falsified financial documents he'd used to launder his debts, carefully preparing them for anonymous submission to the authorities. But that was only the beginning. I reached out to one of the syndicate's middlemen, a man I'd met briefly during a construction deal overseas. I dropped Ethan's name casually, hinting at unpaid debts and loose ends. It wasn't long before the syndicate's interest was piqued. All the while, I played my part perfectly. At home, I was composed, even warm. I shared dinners with Mira and Ethan, laughed at Ethan's jokes, and listened as Mira poured out her apologies late at night. She clung to me as though forgiveness was a lifeline, and I let her believe she had it. The closer I drew them in, the more they relaxed, blind to the storm gathering on the horizon. But behind the smiles and the feigned reconciliation, I moved with precision. Every call, every meeting, every whispered deal was another thread in the web I was weaving, a web that would ensnare them both in ways they couldn't imagine. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late. The meeting took place in a private room at a dimly lit club on the outskirts of the city. The air reeked of stale cigarettes and power, a heady, intoxicating mix that turned even the meek into predators. The man across the table was anything but meek. His name was Kemal, a Turkish trafficker with a reputation for efficiency and discretion. Dressed in a sleek black suit, he exuded the kind of confidence that came from knowing people feared him. "I understand you have a unique request," Kemal said, his accent smooth, his gaze unflinching. I nodded, sliding a file across the table. Inside were photographs of Mira, her basic details, and a summary of the arrangement. "I need her gone," I said, keeping my voice even. "Somewhere far away. You'll find she's resourceful." Kemal opened the file, flipping through the contents with a practiced air of detachment. "She's beautiful," he remarked, his lips curving into a faint smile. "She'll fetch a good price, even in this market." "She's not for sale," I corrected, my tone sharp. "This isn't about money. I want her placed with someone who understands loyalty and the consequences of betrayal. In exchange, I'll clear my brother's debt to the syndicate. Consider it a gesture of goodwill." Kemal leaned back in his chair, studying me. He was no stranger to deals born of vengeance, but he seemed intrigued by the precision of mine. "You do realize," he said slowly, "that once she's gone, there's no coming back. No guarantees of how she'll be treated, where she'll end up. Are you prepared for that?" I met his gaze without hesitation. She made her choices. Now I'm making mine. After a long pause, Kemal nodded. "I'll arrange it, but this won't be cheap. Transport, housing, connections. All of it comes at a price. I'll pay whatever it takes," I said, pulling a checkbook from my coat. The number I wrote would have made a lesser man sweat, but I barely blinked. As I handed over the check, Kemal's smile widened. "Consider it done. I'll have her collected within the week." I proposed the getaway to Mira over dinner, framing it as a chance to reconnect. She was hesitant at first, her guilt evident in the way she searched my face for ulterior motives. But I played my part well, assuring her with a sincerity that came naturally after years of practice. "We need this," I told her, taking her hand in mine, "to leave everything behind for a while. Just you and me." Eventually, she agreed. We left early on a Friday morning, driving up the coast to a secluded cabin I'd rented for the weekend. The air was crisp, the sea breeze mingling with the scent of pine, and Mira seemed to relax for the first time in weeks. That night, we dined by candlelight, sipping wine as the waves crashed in the distance. I watched her closely, memorizing the details of her face, the curve of her smile, the way her eyes softened when she spoke. It struck me then how easily love could curdle into something darker. When she excused herself to step outside, I followed her as far as the doorway, watching as she stood on the porch, gazing out at the dark ocean. The van arrived silently, its headlights off. The men moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding Mira before she had time to react. She struggled briefly, her voice muffled as they secured her and dragged her into the vehicle. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I stood in the doorway, watching until the taillights disappeared into the night. Inside, I poured myself another glass of wine, my hand steady. The house was eerily quiet now, the weight of what I'd done settling over me like a shroud. But I felt no regret. She had made her choice and now I had made mine. The thing about betrayal is that it demands retribution. Myra's absence left a quiet void in the house, but Ethan's continued presence was like a festering wound. Every time I saw him lounging in my chair or rifling through the fridge, the memory of what he had done sharpened my resolve. I spent my nights in the office, sifting through the mess he'd left behind. His sloppiness was staggering: unauthorized transfers, inflated invoices, and offshore accounts linked to the syndicate. What struck me most wasn't the crime itself but his audacity. Ethan had believed I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't fight back. But I did. I altered the records, embellishing where necessary, ensuring that anyone who saw them would believe Ethan was orchestrating a massive embezzlement scheme. I left breadcrumbs leading to his fake accounts, painting a picture of greed and deceit. He hadn't just stolen from me. He'd stolen from the syndicate, and now they would want blood. Once the package was complete, I sent it to 2 destinations. The first was the authorities, cold, calculating, and predictable. The second was the syndicate, a force of nature that wouldn't rest until it had devoured its prey. Ethan's downfall began slowly. A call here, a missed payment there. He started glancing over his shoulder, his usual arrogance cracking under the weight of invisible threats. The night the syndicate finally came knocking, Ethan stumbled into the house pale and trembling. He muttered something about men in dark suits, about threats and warnings I pretended not to understand. "I don't know what's happening," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. I handed him a drink, my expression carefully neutral. "You've always been good at talking your way out of things, Ethan. I'm sure you'll figure it out." The next day, the authorities arrived. Ethan bolted the moment he saw their cars, disappearing into the woods like a cornered animal. I didn't bother to stop him. He was already a dead man walking. I stayed inside, watching from the window as the police searched the area. When they left empty-handed, I poured myself a glass of scotch and allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. Ethan was finally paying for everything he'd done. I didn't ask where they took her. I didn't want to know. The Turkish contact assured me she'd be placed with someone who would appreciate her value. His tone was neutral, almost clinical, but I knew what it meant. At night, I imagined her new reality. A small, windowless room, stripped of the comforts she had once taken for granted. The Mira I had known, proud and sharp, would struggle in that world. I imagined her fighting back at first, her stubbornness leading only to punishment. Part of me thought she deserved it. And yet, another part, a quieter, more insidious part, wondered if I'd gone too far. That thought would creep in when the house was silent, the absence of her voice more haunting than I'd anticipated. Still, when I received the first letter, I didn't open it. The second arrived a week later, followed by a third. Each one bore a Turkish postmark, each one addressed to me in her familiar handwriting. I threw them in a drawer, unopened, letting their presence weigh on me like stones. I imagined what they might say. Pleas for forgiveness, declarations of regret, or maybe desperate anger. But whatever her words, I didn't want to hear them. I had given her a chance to be honest, to choose loyalty, and she had betrayed me. My nights were restless, haunted not by guilt but by the faint echoes of what once was. Mira had made her choices and I had made mine. And yet, I couldn't stop picturing her. Alone, trapped, and staring at the cracked ceiling of some foreign room, wondering if she was thinking of me, The first letter I opened arrived months after Myra's departure. For weeks, I had resisted, leaving them sealed in the drawer of my desk, their presence a reminder of the choices I'd made. But one night, after too much whiskey and an evening spent staring at the empty space where her portrait once hung, I pulled one out. Her handwriting was shaky, almost unrecognizable. "Alex, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe it's better if you don't. But I have to try." She described her new life in fragmented detail. Her days filled with orders barked in a language she didn't understand. Her nights spent in cold silence. She wrote of Seymour, her owner, a man whose cruelty knew no bounds. She spoke of the bruises that marred her skin, the tasks meant to break her spirit, and the suffocating loneliness that came with knowing no one would come for her. "I deserve this, don't I?" she wrote, "for what I did to you, for betraying your trust. But Alex, please, if there's any part of you that still remembers the woman I used to be, help me. Get me out of here. I'll do anything." The words blurred as my hands trembled. I wanted to feel satisfaction, vindication for the pain she had caused me. But instead I felt hollow. The letter forced me to confront a truth I had avoided since the night I handed her over. My revenge hadn't brought me peace. It hadn't healed the wounds her betrayal had carved into me. It had simply replaced one form of pain with another. For the first time, I wondered if I had gone too far. Months passed before I saw her again. I had convinced myself she was gone forever, that Seymour's grip was too tight for her to escape. But one rainy evening, as I poured myself another drink, there was a knock at the door. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. Few people came to the house these days. I had made sure of that. Setting the drink down, I walked to the door, my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't name. When I opened it, there she was. Mira stood in the pouring rain, her frame thinner, her face gaunt. Her eyes, once vibrant, were sunken and hollow. She looked older, her beauty weathered by suffering, but there was a spark of determination in her gaze. I stepped aside without a word, and she entered, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, shivering, as her eyes swept over the house she had once called home. "You're alive," I said finally, my voice cracking. She laughed bitterly, a sound that carried none of the warmth I remembered. "Barely." I motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing, her arms wrapped around herself as if she feared falling apart. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice raw. For a moment I couldn't answer. The reasons I had clung to for so long now felt weak in the face of her anguish. "You betrayed me," I said quietly. "You and Ethan both. You tore apart everything I thought was real." Her eyes flashed with anger. "And you think this, what you did to me, makes it right?" The rage in her voice reignited my own. "You made your choices, Mira. You lied to me, cheated on me, sided with my brother against me. What did you think would happen?" Her shoulders shook, her breath coming in sharp bursts. "I thought you'd leave me, Alex. Yell at me, divorce me. But not this. Not selling me like property." The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. We stood there in silence, the storm outside raging as fiercely as the one between us. Finally, she stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I came back to ask for forgiveness, to see if there's anything left of the man I married. But I see now that he's gone." Her words cut deeper than I expected. I wanted to lash out, to remind her of the betrayal that had driven me to this point. But instead, I felt the weight of her gaze, the broken woman standing before me, and the realization that I had destroyed more than just her. I had destroyed myself. As she turned to leave, I didn't stop her. The door closed softly behind her, leaving me alone in the house that suddenly felt too large, too empty. I poured another drink, the silence pressing in on me. For the first time, I wondered if revenge had been worth it, or if I had become the very thing I despised.